The training manual for the M1 rocket launcher was explicit about the procedure. Gunner takes position. Loader inserts rocket from the rear until it locks. Loader pulls the coiled wire from the rocket's tail assembly and wraps it around the contact spring on the launcher. Loader taps gunner's helmet. Gunner checks the backblast area is clear. Gunner fires. 6 steps. 2 people. The protocol existed because the loading process required steady hands working at the rear of a 54-inch steel tube while the gunner maintained his firing position at the front. In combat, under incoming fire, with a shaped charge warhead and a rocket motor in your hands, the two-person coordination was not a recommendation. It was what made the weapon functional. A trained 2-man team completed the full reload cycle in 12 seconds. The manual specified that solo operation was not authorized. The M1, properly the M9A1 by the time of Iwo Jima, after 3 years of field experience and continuous development from the original prototype that Lieutenant Edward Oule had assembled from scrap materials at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942, was by February 1945 the standard American infantry anti-armor weapon. American factories had produced 476,628 launchers during the war. The M6A3 rocket it fired contained 1.56 pounds of high explosive in a shaped charge warhead that generated a copper jet at 6,000 meters per second, capable of penetrating up to 100 millimeters of steel armor. Against unarmored targets, wooden structures, earthen emplacements, unprotected personnel, the high explosive detonation produced a lethal fragmentation pattern within the target's enclosed space. It was designed for 2 people. The procedure required it. Between the date of the weapon's deployment in Sicily in July 1943 and the end of the war, American factories produced 476,628 launchers and 15 million rockets, enough to equip every Marine rifle company in every Pacific theater operation with multiple teams. The production volume was never the constraint. The 2-man requirement was structural, not aspirational. Douglas Jacobson ignored it 16 times in 2 hours and destroyed a defensive position that a regiment could not break in 7 days. February 26, 1945, Iwo Jima. The island had been invaded 7 days earlier, on February 19th, by 30,000 Marines who had been told to expect light resistance and a quick campaign. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months building a fortress. Not in the above-ground sense that American naval gunfire could identify and target from photographs. The surface installations were decoys and secondary structures, designed to absorb bombardment and satisfy the reconnaissance cameras. The real fortress was underground, 18 kilometers of tunnels hand-dug through basalt and compressed volcanic ash at depths where the Navy's heaviest guns accomplished nothing. 5,000 individual fighting positions connected by a network that allowed defenders to shelter during bombardment, move between positions without exposure, and emerge to fight from locations that Marine assault teams had believed destroyed. Kuribayashi was a professional soldier of the first rank, who had spent time in the United States before the war, and had no illusions about the material comparison between Japan and America in 1945. His tactical notes, issued to his garrison before the landing, were explicit about what they were doing. They were not defending Iwo Jima to hold it. They were defending it to make taking it cost the Americans enough that the calculus for invading the Japanese home islands would become prohibitively expensive. Each day of delay, each additional casualty, was the tactical objective. The island itself was the instrument, not the prize. He designed Hill 382 accordingly. The summit positions were concrete bunkers with walls 4 feet thick, reinforced with volcanic rock, against which naval shells expended their kinetic energy on the surface without penetrating the occupied interior. Artillery was positioned on reverse slopes, invisible to aerial observation, and protected from flat trajectory fire by the terrain. The surface positions were arranged not for their individual fields of fire, but for their contribution to the fields of fire of the adjacent positions. This is the architectural principle that made Hill 382 function as a system rather than a collection of individual emplacements. Each position's fire covered the approaches to its neighbors. Destroy one position, and the positions on either side closed the gap. Attack two positions simultaneously, and the positions between them covered the gap between them. The only theoretical way to reduce the system was to attack from inside it, past the outer defensive ring, against the unprotected rear faces of positions designed to defend against threats from below. No unit that attacked from below had been able to reach the positions from outside. The kill zones between the Marine assault lines and Hill 382's lower defenses were too effective. The 23rd Marines had been attacking since February 21st, 5 days. The regiment had sustained casualties approaching 50%. Each assault attempt produced the same operational sequence. Companies advanced across the volcanic ash into the kill zone. The hidden positions opened fire from locations the bombardment had not reached. Marines died in the open without ever seeing the source of the fire. Sherman tanks that entered the kill zone burned. Flamethrower teams, men carrying weapons that required closing to within 30 yards of the target, died before reaching effective range. The bombardment, which had continued throughout the assault period, was destroying structures that had already been abandoned and was doing nothing to the positions actually in use. The Marine Corps Division Commander's situation report, filed on the evening of February 25th, described Hill 382 as strongly defended and requiring reduction position by position. This was accurate and also meant that the regiment was approximately 50% casualties for a position that the situation report acknowledged could not be taken by the methods being applied. On the morning of February 26th, the 23rd Marines assault was stopped within the first 30 minutes by a single crew-served weapon. Anti-aircraft guns are not ground combat weapons. Their mounting geometry is calibrated for aerial targets, which creates limited depression capability against ground-level targets directly ahead. But the Japanese had positioned this gun to cover the open kill ground below the hill's first defensive positions, a flat approach zone where Marines were entirely exposed. And at 20 millimeters, firing at 120 rounds per minute, the gun was catastrophic against infantry in the open. Company 1 had lost 17 killed and 26 wounded in the first 30 minutes. The bazooka team assigned to the anti-aircraft gun problem had moved forward 15 yards before both Marines were hit. The launcher and its canvas bag of 4 rockets lay in the volcanic ash. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson of Port Washington, New York, looked at the weapon. He was 19 years old, which is worth saying once and not embellishing. 19 is very young to be in his situation. He was from a comfortable North Shore Long Island town, the son of a draftsman, employed in the same trade during summers and as a lifeguard at the Long Island beaches the rest of the time. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve at 17 with a falsified age, because the Corps required 18 and he was not going to wait. He had been at Saipan and Tinian before Iwo Jima. He had no decorations. What he had was 21 months of Pacific Island combat experience, which is a specific kind of education. The nervous system learns, under sustained exposure to incoming fire, to process the combat environment as baseline rather than emergency. Not indifference to danger, which would be pathological, but the operational equanimity that allows accurate decision-making while being shot at. 2 island campaigns produced this in the men who survived them. Jacobson had survived 2 island campaigns. He picked up his rifle and moved toward the bazooka. 1 Marine had already tried to recover it. A sniper had found him at 5 yards. Jacobson covered 30 yards under fire from the anti-aircraft gun and the rifle pit supporting it, reached the launcher, took the canvas bag from the dead loader's shoulder, slung it over his own, and ran back to cover behind a cluster of shattered volcanic rock 30 yards from the gun. The launcher weighed 13 pounds. Each rocket weighed another 11. He set it on the ash, extracted 1 M6A3 rocket from the bag, inserted it from the rear until it seated, connected the ignition wire to the contact spring. The process took 40 seconds. He lifted the launcher to his shoulder, rose from cover, and aimed at the anti-aircraft gun and its 4-man crew at 80 yards. The gun was tracking him. He fired first. The M6A3's shaped charge detonated against the gun's shield, a jet of molten copper moving at 6,000 meters per second. The gun and its crew ceased to exist as a tactical problem. Company 1 began advancing. Jacobson dropped flat and reloaded alone. 40 seconds. He moved uphill toward the next problem. What followed is easier to understand as a series of tactical problems than as a list of positions destroyed, because the list, 16 positions over 2 hours, produces the wrong impression. It sounds like an inexorable march, position after position falling in sequence. The reality was the opposite of inexorable. Each problem was different. Each required a decision that Jacobson had no doctrine for. Some decisions took seconds to make. Several nearly killed him before he made them. 2 machine gun positions had opened fire uphill the moment Company 1 began moving. They were dug into earthen emplacements 70 yards uphill, invisible from below until their muzzle flashes gave their location. Jacobson moved right, using the terrain to get outside their fields of fire. The first position's crew had its gun traversed to engage Marines below, the direction the emplacements were designed to fire, away from the flanks. He reached a position 40 yards from the first emplacement, shouldered the launcher, and fired. The gun and its crew vanished in the explosion. The second crew saw him moving. They swung their gun toward him as he was reloading. 40 seconds, during which he was a stationary target behind partial cover. The gun crew fired bursts at his position as he worked the ignition wire. He dove into a ground depression as rounds tore through the space where he had been standing. He waited for the burst to stop, counted the reload pause, rose, and fired. The rocket hit the gun mount. Both machine gun positions gone. Company 1 was still moving. The first blockhouse was a different problem entirely. Concrete and volcanic rock, walls 3 feet thick. The same material that had survived 16-inch naval shells during the pre-invasion bombardment. The shaped charge warhead of the M6A3 could penetrate steel armor by generating a focused copper jet at 6,000 meters per second. But concrete was not armor. It was mass. A rocket against the exterior wall would blow a hole in the facing material and decelerate in the reinforced core before the warhead reached the occupants. The firing slit faced southwest, covering the main Marine approach from below. There was no angle from the front that a shaped charge would reach the defenders. Jacobson circled to the rear. Blockhouses face the enemy. Their architecture places all the strength, the thick walls, the firing slits, the reinforced overhead, between the position and the threat. The entrance faces the friendly rear, because the rear is supposed to be safe. The Japanese had designed Hill 382's defenses on the assumption that attackers would come from below, from the beach axis, from the direction the positions were built to face. They had not built a contingency for a Marine already inside their defensive perimeter, approaching from behind. He crawled 40 yards through volcanic ash and shattered rock, with the launcher tube scraping against stone behind him. The blockhouse entrance was a low opening barely 3 feet high, covered by a wooden frame. He could hear voices inside, at least 6 men, probably more. He set down the launcher, moved to within 15 feet of the entrance, picked it up again, shouldered it, and fired into the wooden frame from a distance at which the backblast would have killed a second person standing behind him. There was no second person. The entrance frame blew inward. He dropped the launcher, pulled the pin on a grenade, counted 2 seconds, and threw it through the smoking opening. Then a second grenade. Then he entered. The interior was devastated. 4 positions down, 12 remaining, and no rockets. The supply point was 200 yards back, behind Company I's assault line. 3 Marines had been killed that morning attempting to bring ammunition forward across the exposed route between the supply area and the hill. The entire approach was under observation from the summit positions. Mortar fire had been dropping on the supply area intermittently since the assault began. Jacobson made the trip. He stayed low, moved between depressions and shattered rock formations, covered ground in bursts between whatever cover was available. A sniper round hit the volcanic ash 2 feet to his left during the approach. He kept moving rather than freezing, because a moving target is harder to track than a stationary one, and the distance between him and the sniper meant there would be a gap between shots while the bolt was worked. He reached the supply point, found a crate of M6A3 rockets marked in the standard American ordnance stenciling, pulled 4 out and loaded them into the canvas bag, and ran back uphill as mortar rounds began walking across the slope behind him. He came back with rockets and continued uphill. The next position was a pillbox with a narrow firing slit, 3 feet wide, 18 inches tall, designed to minimize exposure while maintaining an effective field of fire. The geometry of the slit was also its tactical vulnerability, though the Japanese had not designed it as one. A machine gun mounted inside a narrow concrete slit has limited traverse. The barrel can only sting so far left or right before hitting the concrete edges of the opening. The field of fire is wide at distance, but the gun itself is constrained at the source. Jacobson moved laterally, forcing the crew to track him. They fired bursts as he moved, each burst adjusting to his last position rather than his next one. He kept moving, faster than the adjustments. The barrel reached the physical limit of its traverse. The crew inside was repositioning the gun mount, a process that required stopping, moving the mount on its pintle, checking the line, securing it. A gap of perhaps 5 to 8 seconds during which the barrel was not pointed at him. Jacobson stopped moving, brought the launcher to his shoulder, aimed at the static slit, and fired. The rocket entered the opening and detonated inside the pillbox. An earthen rifle emplacement 50 yards further uphill. Logs and volcanic rock overhead. 2 Japanese riflemen inside. Presented the opposite problem. No concrete, no fixed slit, invisible to artillery because earth coverings absorb blast. Jacobson flanked uphill above it, reaching a position with a clear downward shot at the overhead cover, and fired. The rocket penetrated through the logs and detonated inside the emplacement. 6 down, roughly a third of the hill's defensive network gone in under 20 minutes of continuous movement. The 6-position cluster at the upper western face of Hill 382 was the defensive arrangement that had stopped 2 separate assault attempts by the 23rd Marines with heavy casualties, and it was the most tactically complex problem Jacobson had faced since the opening minute. The 6 positions formed a semicircular arc, roughly 60 yards across. 2 rifle pits, 2 mortar positions, 1 machine gun nest, 1 reinforced observation post. The arrangement was not a defensive line. It was a killing machine. Each position's field of fire covered the approach to at least 2 others, so that attacking any position frontally meant advancing through the fire of its neighbors. One of the earlier attempts to break this cluster had cost a full platoon, close to 40 men, in under 15 minutes, with no ground gained. The cluster also had a brain. The reinforced observation post had clear views of the entire western slope and was providing targeting data to the mortar crews. Every Company 1 Marine advancing uphill was under observation from that post, and the mortar fire dropping on the advancing Marines was being directed from it. Jacobson studied the layout before engaging. Then he attacked the observation post first. The observation post was not the most immediately threatening position. It was not currently firing at anyone in his immediate vicinity. It was the least visible threat and the most strategically consequential one, for the reason already apparent from watching it work for the past 10 minutes. He fired 2 rockets into the observation post in rapid succession, the second while the dust from the first was still in the air, denying the crew any gap between detonations to recover and return fire while he was reloading. The observation post disintegrated. 2 Japanese soldiers stumbled out wounded and were killed by Marine riflemen advancing below. The remaining 5 positions were now operating without coordination. The mortar crews were firing on estimated company positions rather than observed ones. The machine gun nest was engaging in the direction of the last fire it had seen. The rifle pits were scanning but not directed. Jacobson worked through them by threat priority. Mortar pits first because they were causing the most casualties at range, then the machine gun nest, then the rifle pits with grenades because shape charges were too valuable for 2-man positions. He ran out of rockets before the cluster was finished. The supply point was now 300 yards behind him, further than the first trip, with the mortar crews actively trying to bracket the supply route. Jacobson moved downhill anyway. A mortar round hit 50 yards to his left while he was moving. Another hit closer, the shrapnel screaming overhead. He threw himself flat as a third round impacted 20 yards away, then kept running. He reached the supply point, grabbed another 4 rockets, and ran back uphill while the bracketing continued behind him. He came back and finished the cluster. 13 positions down, 3 remaining. The eastern approach to Hill 382 had a separate problem. Across a shallow ravine from Jacobson's position, a company of the attached 24th Marines had been pinned down throughout the morning by a pillbox positioned to cover the ravine's length. The pillbox sat 15 feet above the ravine floor, its Type 92 heavy machine gun, 7.7 millimeters, 600 rounds per minute, creating a kill zone that no Marine could cross. The route this time ran along the ravine's southern lip rather than back through the cleared western positions, a longer path but one that kept him below the sight line of any Japanese position still active on the upper slope. The pillbox's elevation created the same tactical opportunity it would have at the western face. A machine gun firing downward from a 15-foot elevation cannot be depressed low enough to engage targets directly beneath the position. The depression angle required exceeds the weapon's mounting capability. Jacobson climbed the ravine's edge, exploiting the dead ground beneath into the side of the pillbox that the crew could not cover. He reached a position 50 yards from the slit, slightly below its level, with the angle disadvantaged by his position's elevation relative to the target. He aimed, compensated for the upward angle, fired. The first rocket hit the concrete wall 2 feet above the slit. Chunks of concrete rained down. The machine gun kept firing. He reloaded, 40 seconds, during which the crew could hear him but not see him through the smoke. Adjusted his aim downward by the distance his first round had been high, and fired again. The second rocket entered the firing slit and detonated inside. The 24th Marines crossed it and began climbing. The Type 95 Ha-Go appeared from the eastern base of the hill. 7 tons of light tank grinding through volcanic ash, its turret traversing toward the combined Marine force converging on the summit from 2 directions. The tank's armor specification? 14 millimeters on the front, 12 on the sides, 6 on the rear and top. The M6A3's shape charge was rated to penetrate up to 100 millimeters of steel. The Ha-Go was not an armored threat to the weapon. It was an armored threat to the men the weapon was protecting. Jacobson fired from 70 yards at the left side of the turret. The shape charge penetrated the 14mm plate, detonated inside, and jammed the traverse mechanism. The tank's engine was still running. Its hull machine guns were still operational. The driver was reversing down the draw, trying to back to a rearward position, and the damaged turret was blocking his view upslope in the direction Jacobson was moving. Jacobson flanked around to the tank's rear as it reversed. The engine compartment. 6 millimeters of steel over a diesel fuel tank. He aimed and fired his next-to-last rocket. The diesel ignited. Fire spread from the engine compartment into the crew compartment through the damaged turret opening. 2 crewmen bailed out. Marine riflemen below killed both. The tank burned and the draw behind it was clear. 1 rocket, 1 position. The final blockhouse dominated the summit approach, the largest structure on the hill, the one that the previous 7 days of assault had never allowed any Marine to reach because the defensive network below it had been intact. Concrete walls 4 feet thick, multiple firing slits, at least 6 defenders inside. Battleship 16-inch shells during the pre-invasion bombardment had left scorch marks on the exterior. The walls were intact. Jacobson had reached it, was in a position 40 yards from it, because the 15 positions below it no longer existed. He had spent 2 hours removing the reason the ground could not be crossed. Now the ground had been crossed, and there was 1 position left, and 1 rocket, and no more supply trips needed. He applied the same principle he had applied to the first blockhouse. Don't fire at the face, circle to the rear. The rear entrance, the friendly side that the design had not fortified, because the friendly side was supposed to be safe. He circled right, moving through exposed ground under rifle fire from the firing slits as the defenders tracked him. He dove behind a cluster of rocks, crawled to a new position, rose, and fired at the steel entrance frame. The frame blew inward. He dropped the launcher, drew his M1 Garand, pulled 2 grenades, threw both through the smoking entrance, and went in. The fighting inside was close. When it ended, all 16 positions on Hill 382 had been reduced. Company 1 reached the summit at noon. By 1300 hours, the 23rd Marines held the high ground. The anchor of the entire Japanese northern defensive system had fallen. Company 1 had lost 43 men killed or wounded during the assault period. The 23rd Marines had sustained 50% casualties overall since February 19th. The position that had cost the regiment a week now belonged to roughly 80 Marines who had crossed the final ground in under an hour. Jacobson walked down the slope at 1400 hours, his uniform torn and his face black with volcanic dust and powder residue. A Navy corpsman checked him. Minor cuts, bruises, severe dehydration, no serious injuries. Someone asked how he had done it. He said he didn't know. He had one thing in mind: getting off that hill. The engagement on Hill 382 on February 26, 1945 is included in the Marine Corps' curricula for defensive operations and for the integration of supporting fires at the platoon level. The tactical lessons it contains are specific and teachable. Position your observation capability before your weapons. Prioritize targets by the area they affect rather than the proximity they present. Use terrain to limit the defender's ability to track a moving target. Exploit the mechanical limitations of fixed weapons in fixed positions. These are lessons that can be communicated. Jacobson had not been taught them as a formal curriculum. He had developed them during the engagement, applying to each new problem the information produced by solving the previous one. He had spent 21 months watching how Japanese defensive positions worked and how they failed. What Hill 382 required was that he apply this understanding alone, in real time, under fire, with a reload cycle that gave Japanese defenders a 28-second window to kill him every time he reloaded. He applied it 16 times. Jacobson kept going. The supply point had ammunition. The hill fell. 16 positions, 75 defenders killed. 2 hours, 1 Marine. The training manual was written before February 26, 1945. The island was not declared secure until March 26th. 6,821 Marines were killed. 19,217 were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, 216 surrendered. The rest died in their positions, as Kuribayashi had ordered, and as most of them had understood they would when they built the tunnels 8 months before. Kuribayashi himself died on March 26th, the day the island was declared secure, in a final banzai charge that ended the campaign. He was the last Japanese officer on the island to die. The B-29 crews for whose benefit the island was primarily taken, Iwo Jima was needed as an emergency landing strip for damaged bombers returning from Japan, and as a fighter escort staging base for the final air campaign against the home islands, began using the airfields within days of the landing, before the island was fully secure. Between the February 19th landing and the Japanese surrender in August 1945, more than 2,400 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. At an average crew of 11 men per aircraft, the potential lives preserved by the island's capture are calculable but disputed. Historians debate how many of those landings would have been fatal without the airfield. The operational utility of the island for the air campaign against Japan was not theoretical. 27 Marines and Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima, more than in any other single battle in American history. The concentration is not coincidental. It reflects the specific character of the fighting. No maneuver space, no technological solution to defensive positions engineered specifically to defeat technological solutions. No alternative to individual Marines solving the tactical problem at close range with whatever was available. The terrain and the defensive architecture forced the war down to the smallest possible scale, repeatedly, until it was a man with a weapon and a problem, and no one to ask for instructions. The flag raising on Suribachi on February 23rd produced the most widely distributed photograph of the Pacific War. Joe Rosenthal's image of 6 Marines raising the second, larger flag at the summit, and the men in that photograph became the public face of Iwo Jima. 3 of the 6 were killed on the island after the photograph was taken. 3 survived. The photograph appeared on the front page of hundreds of American newspapers before the campaign was over. It became the most reproduced photograph in history, and the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial at Arlington. Suribachi was important. It was the first Japanese territory on which an American flag had been raised, and its symbolic significance to the Marines on the beach was real and documented in their letters and diaries. But Suribachi fell on February 23rd, 4 days into the campaign, in a relatively swift operation compared to the northern sector. The Japanese defensive doctrine had anticipated Suribachi's capture, and had not concentrated their best defenses there. The 31 remaining days of combat, the overwhelming majority of the campaign's casualties, and every one of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded to enlisted men and junior officers, happened in the northern sector, in the meat grinder, on hills like 382 and Turkey Knob, and in the amphitheater, where no photographer was present. Jacobson is among the men who took the hill. Not Suribachi, which was taken on day 4, but Hill 382, which was taken on day 7 by 1 Marine with a 2-man weapon and 3 trips to the supply point. His name is not widely known. His story does not appear in the standard histories of the battle the way Bassilone's does, or the flag raiser's does. He did not die on the beach or pose for a famous photograph. He walked off the hill at 1400 hours on February 26th, his uniform torn and his face black with volcanic dust, told a Navy corpsman he felt fine, and said he didn't know how he had done it. He had been trying to get off the hill. He got off the hill. The supply point still had rockets in it. Jacobson was promoted to corporal in April 1945. He returned to the United States in September. On October 5, 1945, President Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor at the White House, in a ceremony that also included Jack Lucas, who had smothered 2 grenades with his body on Iwo Jima at age 17, the youngest Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. Jacobson was 20 years old. The Medal of Honor citation for Douglas T. Jacobson, PFC, USMC, includes this language. Determined to reduce the enemy's resistance, Private Jacobson, alone and unaided, attacked and destroyed a series of positions manned by enemy troops who took devastating toll of our advancing forces. He was promoted from private first class to corporal in April 1945, the only promotion directly tied to an engagement that the reviewing boards had initially struggled to describe in standard citation language. He re-enlisted in April 1946. He attended officer candidate school at Quantico. The process of producing an officer from a Marine who had enlisted at 17 with a falsified age, served 3 island campaigns, received the Medal of Honor at 20, and then re-enlisted as a private took 8 years. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in March 1954. The gap reflects the peacetime drawdown of the post-war Marine Corps, the backlog of veterans seeking commissions, and the specific bureaucratic pathway available to an enlisted Marine with combat decorations and no formal secondary education. He served in Japan, in Okinawa, in China during the period when American forces maintained a presence there, and eventually in Vietnam. The service record across 15 years shows the assignments and rotations of a Marine officer who was competent enough to remain employed by the Corps through the period when many wartime officers were released. Before he retired, his commanding officer informed him that he was the only commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps without a high school diploma. He had enlisted at 17, been in the Pacific at 18 and 19, fought 3 island campaigns, received the Medal of Honor, re-enlisted, gone to Quantico, been commissioned, and served for 15 years as a commissioned officer, and the administrative file that should have documented a high school diploma was empty, because he had enlisted before finishing and had never returned. He took the General Educational Development Examination in 1967. He passed on his first attempt. He received his diploma at 42 years old. He retired as a major in 1969 after 24 years of service. He moved to New Jersey, then to Florida in 1987. He worked as a real estate agent and married a teacher he had met in Okinawa. He rarely spoke about the war unless someone asked, and when someone asked, he gave short answers. Douglas Jacobson died on August 20, 2000, in Port Charlotte, Florida. Congestive heart failure and pneumonia. He was 74 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The state of Florida named a veterans nursing home for him, the Douglas T. Jacobson State Veterans Nursing Home in Port Charlotte, which operates today caring for veterans from every American conflict since World War II. In 2014, the facility treated more than 300 veterans of Vietnam, Korea, the Gulf War, and Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously. The citation on the lobby wall describes what he did on Hill 382. Most of the men being cared for in the building have some version of a comparable story, smaller in scale, less formally recognized, equally unrepeatable. Here is the complete forensic accounting. A defensive symbol designed to defeat any attacking force smaller than a company-sized formation, held for 7 days against a regiment. The system worked mathematically. Each position's fire covered the approaches to its neighbors, so that attacking any individual position meant advancing into the fire of the ones adjacent to it. The system failed because one Marine moved inside it and attacked from angles it was not designed to defend. The operational consequence extended across the 4th Marine Division's entire northern sector. Hill 382 had been the observation anchor for the Japanese defensive system. From its summit, Japanese spotters had directed fire across the division's axis of advance. With the summit in American hands, that coordination ended. Adjacent positions that had held for days were suddenly exposed. The division's advance rate increased measurably in the days following February 26th. The bazooka that made this possible was the product of 237 subcontractors across 34 American states, producing components assembled into ammunition, shipped 8,000 miles to Pacific bases, transported to forward supply points on volcanic islands, and stacked in crates behind sandbag walls where a Marine could find them when he needed them. Jacobson went back to that supply point 3 times. All 3 times the crate was there. Without the individual decisions, the rocket stayed in the crate. Without the industrial system, the crate was empty. Both were present on Hill 382 on February 26, 1945. That is why the hill fell.